ready for the next, great, already ready. Next, we'll have Dr. Nathan Sanders from the University of Toronto, who's going to discuss teaching semantics from a JEDI perspective, maybe 2 days later.
Great. Hi. Thanks. I'm really excited to talk to you about ideas that I have for inclusive teaching in semantics. I'm not a semanticist, but I have taught semantics a few times, so I have some insights into it. Uh, I've been part of a project here at University of Toronto on doing JEDI, which I will define for us, which is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'm doing that in the linguistics curriculum here at Toronto broadly. And I want to talk about some of the ideas, big picture ideas of how to do this work in linguistics, and then give you a few ideas that I'll throw out that will hopefully resonate with you as semantics instructors, talking about decentralizing English, a database of diverse names that we've been building, and incorporating social meaning into teaching formal semantics. And then I'll give some concluding thoughts. So, JEDI in linguistics. This is a great week. May the 4th, Star Wars Day. Totally unintentional, actually, but it was great timing. So, JEDI is a common acronym now used to discuss justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. These are important considerations in linguistics, and as human beings, we can't morally ignore these issues. Language-based biases in particular pervade society in many different harmful ways, but especially in education. And there's a huge amount of work on this, on how students with non-standardized varieties, dialects of the local language, or L2 learners, deaf students, how they are disadvantaged in many ways in the classroom, but in society at large. And we as linguists are members of this society where this discrimination is taking place, but we're also experts on language. So we're in a unique position to address these biases, and especially in the classroom because we're instructors. And so I argue that it's our moral responsibility to do this. So if we're not doing it, you're doing something wrong. And so I think it's really important to take these issues into account in a serious way. So what's one big issue, and how might we address it? And one of these issues is the use of the language of instruction, which in the context that we've been talking about here, North America, UK, is usually standardized English. So this is an issue throughout the field of linguistics. Many subfields have historically focused on just a small handful of major spoken languages, especially English. And this can be particularly true in the semantics classroom, where the variety of instruction used, usually standardized English in the context we're talking about, also plays a dual role as the object language that we're studying and talking about, as well as the meta language we use to talk about it, and as inspiration for the notation that we use in the formal language. So this can lead to possible confusion for students because it often relies on subtle typographic distinctions for really important concepts. And sometimes there's not even a distinction. So, for example, Alice, the string Alice, might represent a piece of the object language in English, or it might represent the meta language. If we're using the object language within the meta language, we then sometimes make the distinction of putting it in italics or sometimes quotes. And then in the formal language, the formal notation, we might use small capitals to represent the entity Alice, or Bob, or the set containing Alice, which might be the interpretation of a predicate like run. There's also, the prime notation to represent these ideas, and sometimes just shortening it down to the first letter. But all of this is using the same basic language, and students can really easily get confused. Now, that's just a broader issue of possible confusion, but it's also exclusionary to students who have less direct knowledge of the linguistic variety of instruction. So this puts them at a disadvantage because they are already struggling with the language of instruction, whatever it is. And on top of that, there's the possible confusion that all students are going to encounter where the object language and the meta language and the notational system are all so closely linked. And the students in particular who may be disadvantaged by this are those who have a non-standardized dialect, so African American English. They might be L2 learners. They might be users of an oppressed minoritized language, and this can be especially problematic or traumatic in a classroom where the language of their oppressors is given value and power. They might be deaf or hard of hearing, and as many of you know, especially if you've seen any of my other talks on these issues, signed languages are historically minimized in linguistics courses. They're often just completely excluded, or you get 1 week in your intro course, and then that's it, and they're never talked about again. So there are a lot of ways in which students may be linguistically disadvantaged, which then adds to the confusion issue that I mentioned before. Also, focusing exclusively or primarily on just a single linguistic variety can create false implicatures about linguistic universals or defaults. So it's easy for students to believe that the reason we're looking at English is because it's representative of what languages generally do, right? No matter how many times we tell them this, that it's not, they still get that impression because we keep coming back to English. And so this means that patterns that don't exist in English get at least implicitly treated as abnormal or outright impossible. And English, or the language of instruction, gets positioned as the default setting for language, by which all other languages end up getting compared to, and thus they're implicitly othered. So we have to be really careful here, not to focus so exclusively or even primarily on a single language, especially if it's something like standardized English, which comes with certain power and privilege and exclusionary issues. Because doing this, using English, reinforces the social power of English, of the language of instruction. So students come away from a semantics course that focused on English with the impression that to understand semantics, they're expected to understand standardized English. That to have fluency in semantics means you have to have fluency in English. If we keep coming back to English, keep using English examples, you come away with this idea that, well, semantics is English. I need to know how English works in order to understand how semantics works. So we need to challenge that problem. So some solutions that I'd like to offer. Diversify the object languages and the phenomena upfront from the very beginning and throughout the course from the first day to the last day. Keep throwing out examples from many different languages and many different kinds of phenomena. In particular, not just random languages, but focus on underrepresented and historically oppressed languages, so non-standardized varieties, sign languages, indigenous languages, minoritized languages. And really, really crucial to this, and this ties into a point that Hazel kind of mentioned, is don't just highlight the languages, but highlight their speakers, their signers, and their scholars. If you aren't a member of the relevant community, say so, but then bring in the knowledge from the members of those communities, especially the scholars and especially the people who use this language on a day-to-day basis. A caveat here, you have to be very careful about discussing dialect variation for the language of instruction. So talking about the way dialects of English work, because this can be confusing and exclusionary to L2 users. I've had this issue come up a lot with, here at U of T, we have a very large population of international students, many, many L2 speakers in my classrooms. I've had as many as 50% not be first language English speakers. So you have to be careful here. They get confused, they're not sure. You know, they were taught one way and now they're being told that this other structure is valid, and they get confused about what they should be using. So you have to be careful. It's not that you can't talk about dialect variation in English. You just have to be careful about your assumptions and about what your students' expectations and abilities are. Don't assume that all of your students are going to be familiar with the implications of what it means to speak with a Southern accent. They're not all going to get that. And so you can't just assume it as background knowledge. Also, by shifting away from focusing on one language, on the language of instruction as the object language, this allows us to highlight a range of phenomena that are widespread in the world's languages, but not easily observable in the language of instruction. So some examples that might show up if you shift away from looking at English is things like evidentiality, aspect, politeness, and honorifics. And then there's all sorts of cool lexical semantics outside of English. Many languages have different verbs for eat based on what you're eating, or different verbs for stand or lie, depending on the shape of what is standing or lying. And then, of course, noun classes that go beyond social gender. So these are topics that, I mean, I'm sure many of you touch on these, but I think one thing to think about is how can we increase this even more and really broaden the typological perspective that we use in our teaching. So there are other things that aren't often taught in a typical introductory semantics course. So iconicity in sign languages, or phenomena outside neurotypical adult language. So for example, children have a different understanding of promise than adults do. They don't see it as a promise. They see it as more of a prediction, which is a really interesting thing. So what's going on there semantically or pragmatically? One tried and true strategy for diversifying the languages used in the classroom is to find out what languages our students use. Many instructors do some sort of survey at the beginning, and then you can bring those into the classroom. This requires a bit of extra work. There may be languages that you don't know anything about, and so you have to do a little bit of research to figure out what can be brought into the classroom. But as you do this more and more, you build up a trove of diverse examples that you can bring into the classroom. Here's a caveat. This again goes back to something that, that Hazel brought up. Check in with your students about their comfort level. Don't just assume that they say that they speak this language that you can then put them on the spot and bring it up. Make sure to ask them. Don't exploit them, exoticize them, or force them to be on display. Another solution is to abstract away from specific languages completely. So use storyboards, dolls or toys to set up scenarios and say, what are the entailments of this situation? If I've got 3 dolls doing an action, does this entail that 2 of them did it? And this is completely independent of the language. If you're trying to do something like logical inference or set theory or whatever, um, make it not linguistic. Alternatively, you can bring in constructed languages, conlangs. So many languages, many linguists have had great success in using constructed languages for teaching many different topics in linguistics, um, but I haven't seen it much for semantics. Um, I personally have used conlangs to teach semantic drift, so change over time, but not yet used it for formal semantics, and I'm happy to discuss that with anyone who has ideas or experience doing that. Okay, another bit that I want to talk about here is this diverse names database that my team here has been building. Um, so I'm sure we're all familiar with much of the literature, especially recent work coming out that shows that the linguistic examples that we use often reflect and reinforce different kinds of hierarchies and stereotypes, especially those concerning gender and culture, and especially those that come to the choice of names that we use in these examples. So, inspired by this, as part of this larger project on JEDI pedagogy and linguistics, Lex Connelly, grad student here at the University of Toronto, they've been the driving force in building this diverse names database, which is designed to help linguists replace their usual limited selection of names like John and Mary, with names that are more linguistically diverse as well as more gender inclusive. We first previewed this database last year at the Canadian Linguistic Association, and we're going to be presenting on it again next month. But you're getting a sneak peek, very first time, for the nearly finalized version. So we've got 78 names, so one for each letter of the Roman alphabet, across 3 different gender categories: all gender, feminine, and masculine. We're in the process of checking these with native speakers and scholars to verify that these are indeed these categories, that Amal is genuinely all gender, and that Anahera is genuinely feminine coded, and Aimo is genuinely masculine coded, and so on. We're attempting to make sure that we're representing a completely different language for each name. I think we've still got a few duplicates to work out, but we're aiming for 78 different languages, so one for each name. These represent so far more than 30 different language families and over 110 different countries. So we really intended this to be as broad and diverse as we could possibly make it. Some other considerations that went into this are to make these names reasonably pronounceable by English speakers, so that when you see it, you're not going to stumble over it. We don't want it to be an issue that this name is in the middle of your example sentence. The full database will be available soon on our repository of equity, diversity, and inclusion resources later, Linguistics, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Repository. We've got lots of other resources hosted there. It just went live this week. It's still in early development, but please check it out and give us suggestions. The last thing I want to talk about, and I'm running low on time, so I'll go through this relatively quickly, is how to incorporate social meaning into a formal semantics classroom. So from sociolinguistics, we know that linguistic variation indexes all kinds of social meaning. And students love this. They love talking about this. So bring it in. Slurs, taboo vocabulary, and expressive content is also good, but you have to be careful with that. I'm down to 1 minute, so I'm going to skip this portion of the slides. The slides are on Slack. Please read it. There's some really cool stuff here. But one of the things is, you can get the students to tell you what these things mean to them. Empower them as language experts. Show them that their linguistic varieties are valid, informative, and just as meaningful and structured as the standardized language of instruction. It's really important to bring these issues into the classroom because we don't want to just teach them semantics, we want to make them good citizens of the world. There are huge important debates going on outside the classroom, many revolving around language. Pronouns, gender inclusivity, cultural appropriation of slang, prescriptivism as a proxy for racism. So we want to make sure that they're equipped to handle these debates and to bring something to the table. And also get them to a point where they cannot unsee linguistic injustice when it happens. Final wrap up, just because formal semantics is mathy doesn't mean we get a free pass to ignore the social component of language. Languages are not separate from the people who use them. Utterances are never made without context. There is no such thing as a default language user. We need to erase these concepts from our teaching. Some people have the privilege of having their identities ignored because default and contextless are really usually code for white, affluent, educated, male, cisgender. When we set up idealized scenarios that ignore identity, we're excluding some of our students from the conversation. And they're already excluded by society, so when we do this, we're reinforcing unjust social structures. Language is used as a tool for discrimination. The study of language is necessarily linked to discrimination, whether we like it or not, and we need to deal with that. If we do not actively work to combat linguistic discrimination in our classroom, we're helping to perpetuate it. And that's it.